All right, we just finished our first exercise, and now we're going to start working on our second, where our first exercise focused on finding other people's pixels and having to find high enough quality line art, 2,000 pixels by 2,000 pixels minimum, in order to make something that was print quality. This next project is going to be inspired by something that we find online, but we are not required to have any certain resolution for it, because we are going to be replacing that image with our own shapes. And those shapes are going to be vector shapes, which can actually be made to match any resolution we want. We can print it the size of the moon and it would be perfectly clean if we do this process correctly. Now, in illustration, which is a field I work in a lot, you're asked to match a lot of different artistic styles. You're asked to be able to finish things off, to look certain ways, right? To match other people's styles all the time. And just a basic skill you learn as an illustrator, especially if you're doing kind of imaginative drawing. I worked as an editorial cartoonist for a long time, is this idea of what's called basic shapes. That any complicated form can be broken down into just really simple basic shapes. And those simple basic shapes are circles, ellipses, rectangles, squares, and triangles, right? If you take those 5 shapes and you overlap them, you can make any two-dimensional form in the world. And you'll see this from the drawing books, how to draw cats, how to draw lamps, how to draw trains, the step-by-step. They first build it up with what are called basic shapes. So shapes are the component that underlies everything. So digitally, if you find a piece of artwork that you really like, and this is a digital painting by an artist named James Jean, who was an illustrator and now just does gallery art. And to try to figure out what you like about it, you can also use shapes, right? But these shapes now have color, and they have a certain placement. And what we're going to try to do is be inspired by something and do kind of a minimal version of it, where we're just using solid shapes of color, like cutouts of paper. This is a pretty complicated neo-pop painting by Robert Williams, which has lots of little subtlety and shading in it. And it's a really large oil on canvas painting. But when you reduce it to just shapes, it's not as complicated, right? And yet it still has like the weird presence of the original. And some of those shapes get incredibly complex. And some of the shapes are incredibly simplified, right? Like that whole figure is just reduced to that. And it depends what the focal points are. Or this kind of fan art of the Marvel character Juggernaut. Something I find really helpful that you might find as you're choosing something to be inspired by is if you squint. If you squint, it washes away those details and you just see the big shapes. It kind of flattens everything out. Right? And I actually like this shape composition better than I like this. Right? It doesn't have any of the inking and the detail, but it shows that kind of momentum and mass in an interesting way. We can even do this with photographs, with 3-dimensional things. This is a film still from the Netflix movie The Little Prince. It's all 3D modeling, but we're going to make it 2-dimensional, right? And we're going to do this quickly. We have one day, but it will help us explore what we like about these compositions. Here's another James Jean poster. Pretty complicated diagonal composition, actually. So I learned a lot just having to match that. This is a painting by Edwin Yushiro. Again, pretty complicated, dealing with opacity and transparency, and these are things we can play with our shapes as well. Here's another James Jean. And so on and so forth. So no matter how complicated it is, it can be simplified. And that's what we're working towards. And no matter how simple it is, it can be simplified. And Either way is difficult to do well. Okay, so this is how we're going to start. We go to Google, and I decided I haven't done this before as a demo. You saw all the past demos I've done. I haven't done a true art historical example. So I'm going to do Leonardo da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine, which has always been, a favorite painting. I like it way more than the Mona Lisa. It's just an elegant, beautifully done painting. And I have to find a decent version of it, but I don't need it to be very big. So notice I'm not limiting using tools, any of these things. But large can sometimes help you see the options. And you'll see the variety of how even art masterpieces are shown online. So I think I like this one. The reason it doesn't matter what the resolution is because we're going to be replacing it with our own shapes. And our shapes are going to be whatever resolution we want them to be. So what do? Well, I open in a new tab, the one I'm interested in. Then I open the image in a new tab from there. And that will take me to the actual source image. It's this big. That's big enough. As long as I can see it clearly on the screen, it's big enough to use as inspiration for this project. So then I'm going to save that to my desktop. It's right there. I'm ready to go. I can minimize Chrome. I don't need it right now. I have my class folder floating here. Eventually that will go into a new folder, which I'll call Exercise 2, Shape Tools, Composition. But right now I'm going to leave everything I'm working on the desktop and then organize it into my folder after. So what do I do with my reference once I have it? Well, I need to open it with Photoshop. And we could do this with Photo P if we didn't have Photoshop. But Photoshop's going to work a little bit faster. So this is a raster-based image from the internet. You can only see images online that are pixel-based. So if I zoom in, you can see the pixels. But my shape composition is not going to be pixel-based. It's going to be a vector. So let me show you the difference. A standard vector file format we use is called EPS. I'm searching on this computer for, I'll just look up something. Or an EPS file. I'll go to another semester. Let's see. So kind of a logo assignment. We use vectors a lot when we're doing graphic design that needs to be really versatile. It has to work on stationery and on t-shirts and on the side of trucks and on billboards. That way one vector file can work for all those different sizes. So here I have something called the Glump Monster EPS. So if I open that up, because it's a vector file, it is not pixel-based. So this is raster and pixel-based. Come on, computer. Speed up. And I'm just using preview to view these. So here we go. There's the Glump Monster. It can't even show it to you as an EPS, right? It says it's a PDF, but it is an EPS because look, no matter how much I zoom in, do you see any pixels? No. And that's as far as the computer will allow me to zoom in. But that means that this is infinitely scalable, the Glump. Right? It can be printed the size of the moon and still be perfectly smooth. So it's like cutting something out with a razor blade instead of building it up with square tiles. Difference between vector imaging and raster imaging. And you can do that in color as well. This is a logo. You can see the more I zoom in, there are just no pixels making those curves. All right, so we're going to learn how to do that a little bit. there's a program we'll be learning a lot more later around the midterm called Illustrator that makes vector files. Photoshop is able to use vector shapes, but you are not actually able to output vectors from Photoshop. So you can use them internal to Photoshop. And as long as you have a PSD file, a Photoshop document, you are able to rescale your vector shapes in Photoshop to print at any size. So it works in a limited way, and it's a way to introduce you to the concept before we get into it in a big way. So because this is a raster-based image, I have to come to terms with what its resolution is. And to do that, we go to Image. This is the one I've opened up online, and you're going to all have different proportions. I go to Image, Image Size. And this little window shows us how many pixels it is by how many pixels. And that's ultimately what matters. But if you're not going to go by pixels, like 2,000 pixels or more, right? Then what you need to do is understand that pixels are created by inches with pixels per inch. And this is what we're going to set. We want to make this something that's printable. And what we want is an 11 by 14. So I'm going to make the width of this 11 inches. I'm just going to type it in. And in order to do this, I need to have resample checked. I need to be allowed to change the original. Now notice there's a little chain link between the width and the height, which means I can want it to be 11 by 14, but it's going to preserve its original aspect ratio. It's not going to stretch it. And so I want your image to be at least 11 by 14. And then the resolution becomes an issue. Right? I want it to be at least 11 by 14, and the resolution is going to be our standard lab resolution. I want it to be at least 350 pixels per inch. Now, the computer can do that. The computer can invent pixels. It doesn't do it in a smart way. It just makes rings of the same pixel around the existing pixels. And what that did was it took a file that was only 5 megabytes and it turned it into a file that's 55 megabytes. And you'll notice it starts to soften everything a little bit. Right? But I say okay. And as it does it, it's going to take this image, which was only 72 pixels per inch, screen resolution, and is going to make it print quality. In fact, higher than standard print quality. Standard print quality is 300 pixels per inch. Our lab standard is 350, because that allows us to make it just a little bit bigger if we need to, without losing quality. You will never be allowed to print anything in this lab if it's lower than 240 pixels per inch, because that's when the eye can really tell. And why waste the ink on something that just doesn't look very good? Okay, by doing this, we're taking the computer image and we are kind of ruining it. We're softening it, but we're making it so that the pixel space is big enough to give us a good printout. And then when we build our vector shapes and layer them, we will have them already at the resolution, which will give us a good printout at 11 by 14. My computer's taking a lot longer than it should. I have way too many things open. So when you find that this is your issue, you want to go down to your dock and just make sure you're quitting things that aren't needed. The only thing we need open is Photoshop and Chrome. And I haven't restarted my computer in a while. So this is just kind of maintaining. We want our tools, in this case Photoshop, to work predictably. I'm going to close these other things. All right. So now you can see that the image got a lot bigger on the screen. If I want to shrink it back so where it fits on the screen, I can hit Command 0. Right? If I want to zoom out more, Command minus. Zoom in more, Command plus. We want to keep learning these same shortcuts that we were introduced to with exercise 1. We'll use the same tools in a different way for this exercise. Notice we have our layers here. We only have one layer, it's the background layer. The very first thing I do is I'm going to take a shape.